The theme I'm going to speak to this noon is a very complex one. And it's a story, it's spread over several chapters in the People's School. And it's a theme, and the title that I chose is the title of one of the chapters in the book. And it has nothing to do with football, as many of you know. And I used this phrase in the initial book proposal that addressing the problems with not only with Oregon State University, but other land-grant colleges, because they developed traditions as Aggie schools and where writers didn't go to apply their talents and things of this sort. And among them was Bernard Malamud, and I'll mention him briefly in the talk a little bit later. So what I'm going to do in the beginning is to distinguish between institutions, between Oregon State University and University of Oregon. Oregon State University is a land-grant school. It originated under the establishment of the Morrill Act, passed by Congress in 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes. It's a classic phrase, and it didn't necessarily mean all agriculture or all mechanics, which is also part of the legislation. The Oregon legislature designated Corvallis College, which was a sectarian institution located on 5th Street, as its agricultural school in 1868. Actually, the law was passed in October of 1868, hence the sesquicentennial that's coming up this fall. The state took control of that fledgling school, and I underscore fledgling, in 1885, and the school became the Agricultural College of the state of Oregon. The Morrill Act of 1862 and the Hatch Act, which established agricultural experiment stations beginning in 1887, provided valuable federal funding for the agricultural schools, the land-grant schools across the country, and Oregon Agricultural College was part of that. And my friend Larry Landis, the archivist at the university, has said if it wasn't for the Hatch Act, which provided $15,000 annually to these schools, that it may not have survived. The land-grant schools also share common experiences, more so than state universities like the University of Oregon, because of their historic ties to the federal government. That is in the enabling legislation in 1862 and in the Hatch Act and the extension legislation that was passed afterwards. And Oregon State University shares these common experiences with other land-grant schools in federally mandated curriculum and admissions policies. The University of Oregon's roots are different from Oregon State University in that the university was part of Oregon's Statehood Act in 1859, and the Statehood Act spelled out so many grants of land, so many sections of land, in fact 72 sections, to support a state university. And for most of the American West, the Statehood Enabling Acts stated these kind of provisions where new states were urged to put together a state university. The state legislature established University of Oregon in 1872, but it wasn't until 1876 that the university actually opened. And there's some common features between today's OSU and Oregon State University and the University of Oregon, in that the legislature enabled the opening of these institutions when local citizens raised money to put up the first buildings. And I think you see Deedy Hall there, and ours, of course, is Benton Hall, soon to become Community Hall, or maybe it's officially Community Hall today. The real Civil War, I want to read to you out of my book, just two passages from the book. The real Civil War that I identify as curriculum and not football or other college sports. College football in the United States is renowned for rivalries among state institutions, state universities and land-grant colleges. Michigan and Michigan State, Kansas, Kansas State, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Iowa, and Iowa State. And in Oregon, one of the oldest of all Civil War football games, the University of Oregon and Oregon State University. The Oregon edition dates from the first official football game between the Agricultural College and the State University in 1894. When Oregon celebrates its sesquicentennial in 2018, the schools will participate in their 122nd Civil War match. Although Oregon's annual Gridiron Fest has captured news headlines, infinitely more significant turf wars have involved struggles over academic programs, with state legislators keeping a sharp eye on the duplication of courses. That was the big evil. Interspersed with the fights between the university and the college have been periodic efforts to consolidate the schools on one campus. This happened actually pretty significantly twice in the history of the two institutions. Oregon's two flagship institutions have waged those competitions through most of the 20th century, with rural interests generally supporting the ag school and urbanites favoring the university. To underscore the significance of their differences, the archival material related to curricular fights in Oregon State University's Valley Library dwarfs most other collections. I'll come back with another passage later. So what the state legislature, this noise about duplication of sources, and the state legislature has virtually always been tight-fisted when it came to funding higher education. To provide oversight, state oversight for the duplication of courses, the Oregon legislature created in 1909 the Oregon State Board of Higher Curricula. It's an impressive sounding name. And what that did was to set in motion more than 80 years of curricula and degree battles between the Corvallis School and the University of Oregon. The curricular board ultimately lacked enforcement authority. And at this point in time, the University of Oregon and Oregon Agricultural College both had their own boards of regents. And the curricular board didn't have enforcement authority, in other words, to absolutely enforce the university or the agricultural college to not duplicate courses at the other institution. A person who was very important in all of this was William Jasper Kerr, who was president of Oregon State University longer than any other person, from 1907 to 1932. And he came to Corvallis from Utah State University, where he was president of that institution before coming to Oregon. During his tenure, of course, the Board of Curricular legislative measure appeared, and he had few complaints, at least from what I've read in the documents at OSU, other than citing when the curricular board had wanted Kerr and Oregon Agricultural College to stop duplicating courses, he would cite the required courses that the institution had to offer because it was a land-grant college. And that tradition continues on for the next several decades. Now, there was periodic jousting through the period of the First World War into the early 1920s, and I can't bore you with all those petty turf wars, but in 1925, I see that as the first major clash occurred between the University of Oregon and Oregon Agricultural College. And it occurred when the University of Oregon regents accused the Agricultural College of organizing a school of basic arts and sciences with the intention, and I quote, of becoming a state university. So this is the beginning of the stepping up, the acceleration of the jousting. The University of Oregon regents demanded that Oregon Agricultural College be prohibited from having majors, and I'm quoting, majors in economics, sociology, political science, or Western civilization, end of quote. President William Jasper Kerr, not to be taking this accusation lying down, and I think wrote a long memo. As I recall, it was some 18 pages, accusing the University of Oregon, and I quote, of opening a general attack upon the college. And then, July 15th, 1925, headlines in the Portland Oregonian, curricular fight is ended in a draw. It didn't end in a draw. 2 years later, 1927, Oregon's Governor Patterson called the boards of regents of both institutions to Salem for a peace parley. He reminded them, and I quote, competition between the college and the university should be confined strictly to athletic events. And Governor Patterson at that time convinced the regents to sign a truce, and they did. And I'm reading part of it. We pledge ourselves to loyal cooperation in administering our trust to the taxpayers of Oregon through promoting goodwill between the institutions, end of quote. 10 months later, the University of Oregon threatened, and I quote, an open and statewide fight over unnecessary and costly duplication in certain specific fields of instruction, end of quote. President Kerr responded, this was the university's third attack on the college in 6 years. How often did the curricular board need to reaffirm its decisions regarding curricula at the college? And then 2 years later, in the legislative session of 1929, legislature met before the stock market crash. I want to remind you, a momentous change in higher education in Oregon. The legislature passed Senate Bill 192, creating a single governor-appointed 9-member board of higher education with enforcement authority. This was a new blueprint for higher education in the state that affected generations of students well through my time teaching at Oregon State University. And then I found in Chapter 251 of the Codes and General Laws of Oregon, 1929, and I'm reading part of the chapter, to provide for the management of the state institutions of higher education, to create a state board of higher education, to prescribe its powers and duties, and to abolish the boards of regents of the University of Oregon and the boards of regents of Oregon State Agricultural College, and declaring an emergency. The law also required the U.S. Office of Education to conduct a survey of Oregon's colleges and universities, and that would be Oregon Agricultural College, the University of Oregon, and 3 teachers' colleges. And what's interesting, there are a couple of volumes in the archives that I used. One is the typescript volume, which is this thick, and then there's a published version that's about 3/4 of an inch thick. And it published a series of findings and recommendations. The missions of the schools, the university, humanities and social sciences, the college, sciences and their technical application in a wide range of occupations. And then what I found this a stunning statement in the survey, and I quote, historical developments that disregard these divisions will have to be ruthlessly amputated in order to secure economy and unity in the educational system of the state. And then out of that, of course, the governor appoints the board, the Oregon State Board of Higher Education, which lasted until about 3 years ago. They formed the board in March of 1932 and implemented the statute's requirements right in the midst of the onset of the worst depression in American history. And they appointed as the first chancellor William Jasper Kerr. And the office of the chancellor wound up in Eugene at the University of Oregon to placate the University of Oregon that this wasn't the state board putting a crushing stamp on the University of Oregon in this new state board, its work. The Oregonian was very excited about the new State Board of Education and pointing out to its readers that it had created the first 100% unified system of higher education in the nation. Unified, simplified, and made efficient. I'll come back to that. So what the board did in implementing these policies in 1932 was to completely restructure the curriculum of the University of Oregon and Oregon State College. And this image that you see on the screen shows the chancellor at the top and the two presidents on each side. And I found a document in the library, and for the life of me, I cannot locate it anymore, because they weren't even going to have presidents of the universities. They were going to be lieutenants. And but I've been unable to find that. I found typescript copies, but it doesn't have the, Chancellor, Lieutenant 1, Lieutenant 2, or anything like that. What it did was to create common undergraduate curricula at both institutions. They would be absolutely the same. And the college within the university and the same institution at Oregon Agricultural College was called the Lower Division of Arts and Sciences. And so the idea was like a community college. You could go for 2 years at Oregon Agricultural College, and if you wanted to major in the humanities or arts, you go 40 miles up the valley. And vice versa, if you wanted to do sciences or forestry or some of the other professional schools, you did 2 years in Eugene, and then you would come to Corvallis. Very efficient system. It's actually antithetical to what we think is a comprehensive university today. So the Eugene campus was left without upper division natural and physical sciences. The college was left without upper division arts, humanities, and the businesses. And for most of the 1930s, the University of Oregon and the State Board put forth proposals to restore science to the university and social science and humanities to the college, but the board never acted. College administrators here in Corvallis, especially led by President George Peavy, opposed any changes to the 1932 formula. University President Clarence Boyer pressed for the restoration of science, arguing, and I say correctly, that no legitimate university should be without science. Now, controversially, we could say the same thing about an agricultural college being bereft of humanities or social sciences. One of the more interesting chancellors, he was chancellor for 11 years, Frederick Hunter, went about his work, although there was lots of noise in Eugene and lots of noise in Corvallis about the 1932 formula, as if all were functioning smoothly in the state system. He reported in 1938 that the arrangement had eliminated costly duplication and placed all institutions under a central authority. Let me read a little bit about Chancellor Hunter's. His biennial reports ignored the contentious relationships between the university and the state college, assuring the Higher Education Board and the governor that the system was functioning smoothly. Although the board had made some adjustments to the original curricula design, state institutions were operating, Hunter said, as a closely coordinated and cooperating group with special assignments. The unified system, the chancellor believed, had eliminated costly duplication and placed all institutions under a central authority. Hunter applauded the college as the most important service institution in the region and praised it for applying, quote, science to production. Now, there was a twist to the chancellor's praise for the college's science program, repeatedly emphasizing the association with production. That theme would play into the hands of the university when it declared its intention to establish a program in pure science. So the wars continue. One of the presidents who led, in fact, the president who led the successful attempt to renew science at the university was President Daniel Erb. He came to the university, I think, in 1939, and in the spring of 1941, Erb asked the state board to correct the allocation of degree programs, and he called the present circumstances between the university and the agricultural college an academic outrage. Was, he asked, the Eugene School a legitimate university or simply one branch of a state system of higher education? The academic turf wars grew heated through the summer of 1941, with the college having an acting president, Francois Gilfillan, who replaced Frank Ballard when Ballard became ill, opposing any changes to the 1932 allocation. And I think it's important here to know that Gilfillan, who was an incredibly accomplished scientist and humanist, that he was acting president. He wasn't president, and so he couldn't act with the authority of a president. And I think that that weakened the institution's card, and Gilfillan, if he had been president, might have acted differently than he did in clinging to the 1932 formula. The modification of the unified system happened at a board meeting in October of 1941. President Erb argued that a true university must have at its heart a complete college of liberal arts, including the sciences. Gilfillan countered his argument, saying that the Oregon system was not expected to conform to the patterns and traditions of state universities and land-grant colleges that exist in wealthier states. That was his counter-argument. Well, the October board meeting voted 6-2 to restore sciences to the university. And I'm going to read just an excerpt. This is my, the way I read how this all played out. With the advantage of hindsight, that's valuable for historians. With the advantage of hindsight, the state college's strategy of clinging to the 1932 formula was misguided. College and university educational policies are dynamic, subject to periodic readjustment. President Peavy and acting President Gilfillan clung to the 1932 protocol in the face of the university's increasingly aggressive moves to reestablish its science programs. There is no evidence that the state college leaders considered compromises that would have moved its own curricular programs in a more comprehensive direction. After the Ashland meeting, the college sought to restore business and mining engineering degrees that it had lost in 1932, but it made no move to expand programs in the liberal arts, objectives that it would only belatedly address in the decades following the Second World War. And now I'm going to shift to post-war curriculum struggles, where I think both the state board and the university turned back every effort of the state college to expand its curriculum. It's important, though, for you OSU boosters to remember that the university was the principal obstacle, but not the only one. There were problems on the Corvallis campus itself. When Lower Division Dean Ralph Colby and English Department Chair Walter Foreman proposed a general studies major. The college's curriculum council turned it down, refused to give its support. And then Colby and Foreman, to me, they seemed apologetic, acknowledging that the lower division, that's what it was called at the college, its obligation to the service of the other schools on our campus. It acknowledged our obligation to as a service to the other schools on our campus. The attitude evident in that statement is reflected in Bernard Malamud's A New Life. That sentiment in what became the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in 1959, the College of Liberal Arts in 1973, had a long shelf life after my arrival in 1971. And now, just a section on the slow climb to parity between OSU and the University of Oregon. Oregon State College became Oregon State University in 1961. The state had a new chancellor in 1959, John Richards, who announced in that year that the state board agreed, it was still the Oregon State College in 1959, that the state college be permitted to offer general degrees in humanities and social sciences. Now that's the camel with its nose in the tent, said University President O. Meredith Wilson. He delivered an hour-long argument to the state board, asking the board to maintain the special functions of the two schools, charging that division majors would lead to department majors. And that parallels the argument, ironically, that George Peavy and Francois Guillaumin used in 1941. In other words, granting those kinds of erosions of the formula from 1932. My reading of the history of other land-grant schools indicates that liberal arts degrees at Oregon State University lag behind most other institutions, the rise of humanities and social sciences. And I looked at Iowa State, Michigan State, Montana State, and Purdue, and Indiana, and Indiana University. And I was telling someone before we began this noon that Montana State University had history graduate degrees in 1952. Well, today in my old Department of History, which is now gobbled up in a school, it has a master's degree in history of science and a PhD in the history of science. It still doesn't have a general master's degree in history, but I assume it could have if it wanted. Disciplinary majors did come. O. Meredith Wilson was correct that once you offer division undergraduate, these are undergraduate majors, by the way, I'm not talking about graduate programs, that it would lead to department undergraduate majors. English was the first department in the School of Humanities and Social Science to grant a bachelor's degree in 1965. And then the next year, art, economics, history, political science, speech also gained the right to offer undergraduate degrees. And God, I never knew this. I mean, I was hired 5 years later. So it's an incredible story. And Robert McVicker, and I've shared this with John Byrne, was a true old guard land-grant president, that the 1932 formula should largely stay. And so what I'm going to do is read to you what I've written about Robert McVicker's years. When College of Liberal Arts Dean Gordon Gilkey announced his retirement in the fall of 1976, McVicker's job posting described the college as an inheritor of a lengthy tradition of divided curricular responsibilities that limited graduate degrees to single interdisciplinary programs. This rather unusual circumstance, McVicker wrote, required a person with a commitment to undergraduate education and an understanding that graduate programs should be interdisciplinary. McVicker emphasized the need for a dynamic leader who understood the parameters of a system with non-duplicative programs of graduate education. For the remainder of his presidency, McVicker believed that state board guidelines largely adhered to the non-duplication principles of 1932. In a letter to a former dean in 1977, McVicker remarked that the state board had reaffirmed its opposition to graduate programs for the College of Liberal Arts. When pressed by constituents about the absence of graduate programs in the behavioral sciences, the president deferred to state board policies to explain the constraints of such graduate degrees. And I shouldn't say when I wrote the chapter, one chapter is largely devoted to McVicker's presidency. I'm critical here in what I wrote about McVicker, but I loved reading his letters. And I mean that. He was, as some of you in the room know, a hands-on president. If I wanted a travel voucher to go to a history conference, he signed it. And so forth and so on. And he would argue that he was not an absolute opponent of alcoholic beverages, but he fought like hell with the city council when they were going to allow the opening of selling alcohol on Monroe Street, time after time after time. On the other hand, when a restaurant downtown, remember the night deposit? He thought that was a nice deal because when they had visitors in town, the president could take someone there for dinner in a very pleasant surrounding. Anyway, chapter 11, title of my book is Becoming a Modern University, and it centers, much of it, this chapter centers on the work of President John Byrne, president from 1984 to 1995. And John said when he first became president, his ambition was to create an atmosphere of change and the pursuit of excellence at the university. High on the list was strengthening and improving the library and computer systems and the liberal arts. And now I've called the library a bottom feeder in state funding, and certainly in the humanities and social sciences it was even less than that. And John Byrne worked hard to improve the library's budget, reallocating funds to boost library collections and its computer system. And then he also transferred unrestricted gifts to colleges, like Science George, and put that money in the library's budget. And I first learned of this when talking to former librarian Carol Butcher. And Carol refused to have me cite her as the source. So I asked John, and he said yes. He took money from other colleges that wasn't designated specifically for purposes and put it in the library's budget. And the other part of this story that's fascinating to me is John Byrne's efforts at fundraising for the library, not just in books and computer systems, but also expanding and enlarging the library, along with librarian Melvin George. Public and private gifts for the expanded and renovated library came to some $47 million. And of that $47 million, 900,000 alums, students, staff, and friends were involved in that gifting effort. The advances of the College of Liberal Arts paralleled the funding efforts to improve the library's holdings, and a lot of that in the humanities and social sciences. Another element that occurred during this period was what I call greater curricular parity within the university for graduation requirements. In 1985, the Oregon State University Curriculum Committee required more undergraduate courses in liberal arts to satisfy graduation requirements. Then came Provost Graham Spanier, who, I think 1986 or 1987, reduced liberal arts annual teaching loads from 3 to 2 classes per term on parity with the professional schools on campus. I personally remember that as a great morale booster. Spanier also initiated the Distinguished Professor Awards. Another advance for the College of Liberal Arts was Burns' support for the Center for the Humanities and the purchase of a home on Jefferson Avenue for the location of the center. Burns renewed Oregon's Honors College, which was a victim of ballot measure 5 in 1990. It was resurrected in 1993 as a degree-granting institution. When John Burns left the presidency in 1995, OSU had made significant strides toward becoming a comprehensive university. And now, lastly, my mea culpa. And I delighted writing this. I got to figure out a way to end this talk. And this is what I've written. This is what I wrote for this presentation. I need to say that the advantages of historical perspective provide important insights for historians. I would never have written the following when John Burns left office in 1994. And this is what I wrote in my book. Burns' 11 years as head of the institution show him to be an innovator who understood the prerequisites of a truly modern, comprehensive university. While Oregon State University was playing catch-up to other Pac-10 schools, Burns' emphasis on the strategic importance of the library and computing moved the institution closer to parity with other conference universities. His promotion of the humanities, the Honors College, and related matters was important to modernizing the academy. Thank you.